In the heart of Boston, where cobblestone streets twisted like veins through the city's history, there was a darkness creeping, moving unseen, like a fog rolling in from the harbor. It was the kind of darkness that settled deep in the bones, that sent shivers down the spine even in the light of day. And for the women of Boston in the early 1960s, that darkness had a name. They whispered it in hushed tones, their voices trembling with fear. They called it the Boston Strangler. The first body was discovered on a humid summer morning in June of 1962. Anna Slessors, a quiet, church-going woman of 55, was found dead in her small apartment on Gainsborough Street. Her body lay crumpled on the bathroom floor, her housecoat stained with blood, the cord of her bathrobe tied in a grotesque bow around her neck. There were no signs of forced entry, no screams heard in the night. Whoever had killed her had been invited in, had spoken softly enough to ease her fear, until he tightened the cord and watched the life drain from her eyes. The police were baffled. There was no clear motive, no obvious suspect. But they assured the public that it was an isolated incident, a crime of passion, a domestic dispute gone horribly wrong. For a time, the city believed them. They wanted to believe them. But just 2 weeks later, the darkness struck again. This time, it was Nina Nichols, a 68-year-old retired physiotherapist, found strangled in her apartment across the Charles River in Brighton. Her body, too, was left with the same macabre signature, a pair of nylon stockings tied in a bow around her neck. Her apartment was in disarray, but nothing had been taken. Nothing except her life. The city began to stir with unease. 2 women, both strangled in their own homes, both left with the same mocking symbol of death, a bow, as if the killer were presenting them to the world as some grotesque gift. The newspapers picked up on the pattern, their headlines screaming warnings of a killer on the loose, a predator who stalked the streets of Boston looking for his next victim. And then, the city held its breath, waiting for the darkness to strike again. And strike it did, with a viciousness that seemed to grow with each new victim. In August, Helen Blake, a 65-year-old divorcee, was found strangled in her North End apartment, her body mutilated, her neck encircled with a silk scarf tied in that same sinister bow. The killer had left no fingerprints, no trace of his presence except for the marks of his brutality, the chilling signature of his handiwork. Now the fear was palpable. Women were locking their doors, drawing their curtains tight, eyeing every man they passed on the street with suspicion. The city had become a place of whispered conversations and darting glances. A curfew of the mind had descended. No one dared to walk alone at night. The killer was out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting, hunting. The police were under immense pressure. They formed a special task force, combed the crime scenes, questioned everyone they could find, but the clues were few and far between. They knew the killer was charming, confident, able to talk his way into the homes of his victims. They knew he left no trace, no fingerprints, no evidence to follow. It was as if he were a ghost, a shadow that slipped in and out of the light, leaving only death in his wake. And so, the city waited in terror, knowing it was only a matter of time before he struck again. And he did, with horrifying regularity. On the first cold morning of December, Sophie Clark, a 20-year-old black student, was found strangled in her apartment on Huntington Avenue. Unlike the others, Sophie was young, vibrant, full of life. Her death shattered the city's fragile belief that this killer targeted only older women. No one was safe. The terror spread like wildfire, igniting fear in every household, in every heart. Then, on New Year's Eve, as Boston prepared to welcome a new year, another woman was found. Patricia Bissett, 23 years old, pregnant, strangled with her own stockings, a bow tied tight around her neck. The killer had grown bolder, more daring. He seemed to relish in the panic he had caused, seemed to feed off the fear that gripped the city like a vice. He was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom that moved through the streets with impunity, slipping past locked doors and deadbolts, finding his way into the homes of his victims with a terrifying ease. The police scrambled to catch him, but the clues were too few, the pattern too erratic. He struck without warning, without reason, as if driven by some dark force, some unquenchable thirst for death. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the killings stopped. For a time, Boston dared to hope that the nightmare was over, that the killer had moved on. or been caught for some other crime. But the fear lingered, a shadow that clung to the city, a reminder that darkness could strike at any moment. Women continued to live in fear, their doors locked tight, their windows shuttered against the night. Months went by with no new murders, no fresh horrors to fill the headlines. The police had little to go on, and the public grew restless, demanding answers, demanding justice. It seemed the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a trail of bodies and broken lives. And then, in October of 1964, a man named Albert DeSalvo was arrested for a series of unrelated sexual assaults. He was a small-time criminal, a drifter, a man with a dark past but no history of violence. No one thought much of him at first, just another creep in a city filled with them. But then, DeSalvo began to talk. He began to confess. In chilling detail, he described the murders, each one with an accuracy that made the detective's blood run cold. He knew things only the killer could know, the way the women had been tied, the order in which they'd been killed, the looks on their faces as they took their last breaths. He spoke of the thrill, the power he felt as he watched the life drain from their eyes. He spoke of the voices in his head, the ones that told him to kill, the ones that whispered in the dead of night, urging him on, feeding his hunger. But something didn't sit right. There were gaps in his story, inconsistencies that nagged at the edges of the truth. Some of the details were wrong, some too vague. The police were unsure. Could this man, this simple-minded, broken soul, really be the Boston Strangler? Or was he just a desperate man looking for attention, for some strange form of fame? Despite their doubts, DeSalvo was charged, not for the murders, but for the sexual assaults. He was never convicted as the Boston Strangler. Yet, the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. The killing had stopped. The terror, at least for now, seemed to have passed. But not everyone was convinced. There were those who believed the real killer was still out there, that DeSalvo was just a patsy, a convenient scapegoat for a city desperate for closure. They believed the true Boston Strangler still walked the streets, still looked into the eyes of women, still dreamed of the kill. DeSalvo was stabbed to death in prison in 1973, taking with him whatever secrets he might have held. And so the case remained unsolved, a puzzle with too many pieces missing, a story with too many dark corners. Today, the name Boston Strangler still sends a chill through the city, a reminder of the time when the shadows moved through the streets, when a killer stalked the alleys and back roads, hunting, watching, waiting. Some say he was a man like any other, a human with a twisted mind. Others say he was something else, something darker, something that walked in the guise of a man but belonged to the night, a creature that fed on fear, on pain, on death itself. The case remains open, the questions unanswered, the mystery unsolved. And so, the legend of the Boston Strangler lives on, a ghost in the shadows, a whisper in the night, a reminder that sometimes the darkest monsters are the ones we cannot see, the ones who move among us, unnoticed, unknown, until it is too late. And the women of Boston, even now, still lock their doors at night, still listen for the sound of footsteps on the stairs, still fear the knock on the door, knowing that the darkness could return, knowing that the shadows are never far away.